fortunate to have Brooke Weitzman with us, and I'll tell you about Brooke in just a second. Please submit any questions you have via the chat room so that we can answer them along the way. Brooke is a graduate of the UCI Law School. She's been an advocate for the homeless for years, even though she's so young. She was advocating before college, I think. She successfully litigated cases in federal court to change the county's response to the housing crisis. In 2017, she went before Judge David Carter, seeking rights for the homeless in the tent encampments along the Santa Ana riverbed. And because of her work for the homeless, she was named by the Orange County Register as one of the most influential people of 2018. She's also the co-founder and directing attorney of the Elder Law and Disability Center. The center provides free clinics and new and low-cost legal services for seniors and disabled and other disadvantaged groups in Orange County. So Brooke Weitzman is one of those individuals who truly is making a difference for the disadvantaged in Orange County. We thank you so much for your work, Brooke, and thank you so much for coming to talk to us tonight.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for having me. I'm excited to be here. I will warn you all that this remote thing means my dog doesn't know that I'm not here for him, and sometimes demands to go out, which is what just happened. So if I pause for 10 seconds and run to the door, it's because the dog demanded it. He didn't understand that I was working. So what I was thinking that I would do is we'll start off with just kind of you guys send questions in. As you have them, I'll try to keep up with them as I go. And if I get confused by the chats, I'll circle back to them at the end. But I would tell you a little bit about kind of what the Elder Center is, what we do, and then talk to you some about what the COVID related challenges are for the homeless community, what things have changed in terms of what resources they do and don't have in light of the COVID crisis, because it is, there he goes. So if he doesn't stop in a second, I'll put him on a leash where he can be controlled. Yeah. Well, sorry, give me 10 seconds.
That's a Zoom call for you.
All right, I left him outside. We'll see how long that lasts. So a little bit about kind of what's going on with homelessness in light of COVID, because while I know there's a lot of other stuff going on right now, we are still in the midst of a global pandemic. And so kind of there is the balance of all of the hard work that's being done to support Black Lives Matter and to reduce racial injustice, and ideally eliminate injustice, but also keeping people alive in the midst of a global pandemic. And then tell you a little bit about what's happening in Orange County related to the current situation, what's available to folks who are homeless, what isn't available, what we expect to happen over the coming months. So I might have to let him back in, but then after that, he should be under control for the rest of the hour. So the Elder Law and Disability Rights Center is a small nonprofit. We founded, we're in our 4th year. And my partner and I came from the free legal services, and we found that we were often turning people away who didn't quite qualify for the type of services we had, and who we knew could never afford private lawyers. And so we really founded to fill that justice gap. Our mission was serving the communities, and we do that partially with sliding scale legal services, charging about 1/3 of what private lawyers do for a lot of elder law and disability related services, and partially with serving communities that didn't really fit into traditional legal services where they have to come to the service because we're able to go to them. And so that ends up being the homeless community, and a lot of seniors who really needed services that are going to come to them. And we're actually kickstarting right now our special education program, which is going to be able to bring services to youth with special needs around the county as we grow it over the next couple of years. So in the context of that, all right, I'm going to let him in, and then I don't think I'll have any more interruptions. Sorry for the Zoom problems. All right. No, wait. So in the course of learning how to remotely talk with an ornery dog in the house, I don't know how people with live human children do it. And in the course of that, as we were getting started, before we even had office, we really started working a lot with the unsheltered community. People experiencing homelessness are a group of people who I really like working with, and who are often kind of forgotten in services because they are sometimes harder to serve. They don't always have phones. They don't always have mail. We really have to go to them. And that's kind of what kickstarted a lot of the work the ELDR Center does. So we'll fast forward to 2020, the COVID pandemic comes, and the homeless community starts seeing a lot of challenges they didn't see before, particularly the more hidden homeless community. So most of the people who you don't see, the seniors who lost their housing but still live in their car, women fleeing domestic violence who kept their car, working families, a lot of the people who have pretty consistent income but not enough to maintain housing. A big part of the way that those communities survive is that they get a storage unit and they get a 24-hour gym membership. And so they're able to go to those 24-hour gyms before you get there. They go on reasonably early in the morning and they can take a shower every day, and that gym membership is much cheaper than rent. They're able to maintain a storage unit where they can keep their clothes so it's not obvious to everyone that they live in their car. And they're able to maintain the minimum cost to keep their car running most of the time. And so most people, when they first lose their housing, especially folks who initially become homeless over 55, start off living in their car. It's not until a few years into homelessness that they become fully unsheltered. And when the COVID crisis came, most of the sources that community used for food and hygiene were suddenly gone. So we have a whole community that relied upon gyms for the bathroom, relied upon gyms for showers, many of whom have medical needs, many of whom are senior, and they suddenly had nowhere to turn. And then of course, there are all the people who are already completely unsheltered, who normally relied upon restaurants with public restrooms, or coffee shops, beaches, parks, right? There are a whole variety of places that people use in order to wash a minor cut, go to the bathroom, attempt to bathe. It's certainly an ongoing issue at a lot of areas, particularly South County areas. There's always disputes of, well, the homeless folks are trying to wash themselves in the bathroom. The community doesn't want that. And my answer is usually, well, that's an easy solution. Give them a place to wash themselves, right? They don't want to wash themselves in the bathroom either. So if we bring in mobile showers, if we give them an indoor option, they won't be in the library trying to shower in the bathroom. But the library is closed and all the public resources closed. And so we started seeing a big spike in skin infections, in all types of kind of preventable conditions that people weren't able to take care of because they didn't have access to kind of those basic resources that they did before. We started seeing a lot more people who couldn't get access to adequate food, right? The folks who are in cars can drive through. There's lots of drive-through food banks right now, probably more than before, because there are so many families that are struggling to serve themselves right now. But because of COVID, they're all drive-through. And so for those who don't have cars, the options have become incredibly limited, right? They used to rely upon folks for a lot of churches would go out and bring leftovers to a park. A lot of businesses would have meetings and bring all the leftovers to a park. There were a lot of kind of people would go out to a restaurant and they would have leftovers, or people would panhandle on the street. And as folks were out and about eating, going to coffee shops, they would see someone and say, hey, I'll give you $5, go get a meal, or come inside with me, I'll order you a meal. All of those kind of traditional sources of foot traffic based food were suddenly gone because the providers are mostly retired seniors who are staying home to take care of themselves, right? And so when it wasn't so much that there wasn't the food anymore, but that there wasn't the delivery mechanism. And so the meetings weren't happening. There wasn't automatic leftovers, and the systems, as people are scrambling to figure out how do we interact with each other in an internet-based world, really didn't account for how to feed people who are unsheltered. And then on top of all of that, right, COVID is and the reason all that happens, a highly transmissible disease. It is dangerous in congregate living. And we see a lot of focus on congregate living like jails, right? There's tons of kind of statewide and national steps to reduce the people from jails who were just there because they couldn't pay bail, right? Who were there because they had not been convicted yet. They were waiting for a trial. The trial's not going to happen anytime soon because we can't put a jury in a jury room in the midst of a COVID pandemic. And so reducing bail to 0 and letting those people go back to their lives pending the next court date. We saw a lot of getting people out of jail who didn't have that much time left in their sentences because the risk was so high. And then, of course, in the skilled nursing facilities, and we see that on our county's website, tracking the number of deaths related to skilled nursing, we see a lot of kind of national movement toward protecting seniors and a lot of kind of ageism, right? We see a lot of places go, oh, well, you know, everyone who's dying happens to be over 65, which is both untrue and does not make any lives less valuable than others. And so we see a lot of focus nationally and locally on how do we protect people in congregate living like jails and skilled nursing and assisted living. We're not seeing as much of that focus on how do we protect people in our shelters, right? So in the jails, everyone was moved to 6 feet apart. The sheriff has taken, has reduced the population, has taken really careful precautions to make sure there are careful and data evidence-based processes, at least from what, obviously I haven't been in the jails, but from what he says, in order to protect people in that congregate living. In skilled nursing facilities and assisted livings, we saw a lot of steps happen to try and make them safer, to try and make sure that staff weren't transmitting COVID from one facility to the next. In congregate homeless shelters, we really haven't seen that. So in Orange County, most of our congregate homeless shelters still operate under the policy that it's okay if beds are only 3 feet apart. And so, when beds are only 3 feet apart, you can imagine if 2 people need to stand up at the same time, they're only inches apart. And when you're talking about a population where at least some people have a lot of trauma, some people may have more mental health challenges or trouble remembering rules because of their trauma, it is hard for them to think, oh, I'm supposed to stay 6 feet apart from people, except when I'm not allowed to stay 6 feet apart from people. And so we're sitting there saying, stay 6 feet apart from people, except your bed is going to be 3 feet from your neighbor, sometimes less. We're not providing eating in most of our shelters. You're not allowed to bring food to your bed area to help avoid critters, bugs and things. That makes sense. But most of our shelters don't have space for people to sit 6 feet apart while they're eating. So while we're having conversations about how can restaurants set up safely, we're not implementing those same minimum standards for safe congregate eating in our homeless shelters that we are in our restaurants. And there's no particular reason for that other than how we value the lives of the people there, right? That's a decision that we have made as a county with the folks we have elected. So I certainly am in regular conversations about why those standards aren't higher. And to the extent that the county has some standards, even that 3-foot standard, bringing in health and safety when we have had COVID outbreaks, because we have in Orange County homeless shelters, in the ones that the county owns and operates, the county has implemented procedures. So for example, in one of the county run shelters, when they discovered COVID, they did probably the best they could. They brought in the healthcare agency. They tested everyone who was interested in being tested. They offered everyone the option to go to one of the isolation motels and stay in a room for 14 days and retest. They offered everyone who tested positive the option to switch over to the motel. They disinfected everything. But the county so far believes they're only responsible for doing that in the couple of shelters that the county owns and operates, not the many shelters that operate within the jurisdiction of the county, right? So we have in Orange County city shelters. We have shelters in Tustin, Placentia, Santa Ana, Laguna Beach. There are lots of domestic violence shelters. There are lots of family shelters scattered around the county. And there are lots of kind of small church shelters. And while they're not, many of them get at least a little bit of money from the county, but they certainly all should be held to the same health and safety standards as the same resources that you and I use, right? So if our chairs should be 6 feet apart, it seems reasonable that the county health department should require that those beds and their chairs when they eat be 6 feet apart. And that's just not the system that we have in place so far in Orange County. So homeless folks were faced with this immense challenge where they don't have regular access to the news. What they're hearing is there's something scary and it might kill me. And people keep telling me that because of my health, I'm at higher risk of dying if I get sick, but I don't know how to stay 6 feet away from people. I don't know where I can wash my hands. I can't find a meal. And if I try and get help, I have to go near someone. And if I have a scratch on my arm and I can't wash it, it gets infected. Should I go to the hospital? Because someone told me you're not supposed to go to the hospital because of COVID. So there was really kind of a disconnect between the information they're receiving. And while that's happening, the CDC is putting out guidance. So the CDC says that the best possible way in which to address homelessness during this pandemic is to get people into individual rooms with individual bathrooms. And that makes sense because that is the only way that they would have the option to self-isolate at least most of the time, right? For something that is transferred through air droplets from talking, from yelling, anywhere that you're sharing space, even if what you're sharing is the bathroom, that, you know, porta potties that different people are transferring in and out of, there's going to be a high risk of transmission. So the CDC said the number one best thing you can do, get everyone right now into an individual room with a bathroom. And then they said, in fact, the national government thinks that's so important that FEMA is going to pay 75% of the cost, California, because of your high number of homeless people. If you want to take the people who are most likely to get very sick if they get sick, so the people who are either over 65 or medically compromised, if you want to get them all into rooms, we, FEMA, are going to pay 75% of the cost because that's the best way to do it. And then the CDC put out some other guidance. They said, you know, if you can't get them into rooms, the best thing you can do is keep them exactly where they are. If that is outside in a tent, bring hygiene to them. Anytime there's an encampment of more than 10 people, put out hand washing in bathrooms. If that's in a shelter, do your best to get some people out of the shelter, reduce the population to enable them to have social distance. But keep them where they are in the shelter until you can get them into individual rooms. And so as the CDC started putting out standards, we saw mixed responses, right? We saw some counties where they started implementing those. So in Skid Row and a little bit in litigation, but they ended up putting out, you know, hand washing stations on every block, porta potties on every block. In Orange County, initially, everyone had closed all the public bathrooms. And after we sent them some lovely letters, many cities decided to at least put out a porta potty. Not all. So for example, the city of Stanton currently has a pretty large homeless encampment. There's really no available shelter, so people don't have somewhere else to go. And to date, Stanton has refused to allow even a hand washing station, even after I convinced the county to pay for it. And so there's no particular reason for that other than the city has decided they hope people will disappear if they can't wash their hands. So when we have individuals who go out to help with wound care, they're telling me when they go to Huntington Beach, which while I disagree with their homeless policies all the time, Huntington Beach said, oh, you're right, we do need bathrooms. We'll unlock them in some parks and we'll put portable ones into other parks. So in a city like Huntington Beach, where they currently do have access to hand washing and bathrooms versus a city like Stanton, and they happen to be two cities that have larger encampments right now, the current health of the unsheltered community, those experiencing homelessness, is different, and it's tangibly different. We're seeing, when you look at the number of people who died without a fixed abode per month, that this is the second month in a row that we've seen almost twice as many last month and a little over twice as many this month. People die as last year. So same month last year, in May was 14 deaths. In May 2020 was 30 deaths. And we don't know yet if that's because of COVID or because of the lack of hygiene or because of the lack of food, because the coroner takes a while. But when we're seeing it consistently 2 months in a row and expect it's going to continue to increase, we need to recognize that we are having an actual tangible toll of lives in addition to the toll of health costs on the homeless community. So with that kind of as the context of the things that homeless folks are looking at just from the outside, I will turn to, unless there's something in the questions that I should answer first, I'll try and read them at the same time. I'll turn to kind of what is the county doing, right? So what is Orange County doing? So as FEMA agreed to pay toward the rooms, the governor of California implemented what I suppose many of you have heard of by now, which is Project Room Key. And the governor of California said, you know, if they're going to pay 75%, I'm going to pay 25%, and then you just have to cover the services on top of that. I want you to get these high-risk individuals, the people who, if they do get sick, are most likely to end up hospitalized and either die or be very expensive. I want you to get them into a place to shelter in place. And so many different counties implemented that program different ways. The way in which Orange County implemented it is different than any other county. And the biggest thing about it that's different is that in many counties, they operate them as rooms. So people can treat them as housing, they can shelter in place, and they can go about their day in compliance with the existing health rules, just like you and me. In LA, they operated a little bit like a shelter. So they can't bring anyone to their room, but they have to come back by a curfew. They're encouraged to wear a mask and do social distancing when they leave, but they can come and go. I think in LA it's 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So people can go, and there's exceptions for folks who need to go to work or doctor's appointments or other things. In Orange County, the way in which it was implemented was in order to enter Project Room Key, all rooms are isolation rooms. And so whether you're going in because you currently have been presumed sick or confirmed sick with COVID, or you're going in just because you're a senior or a person with a medical condition, if you want the what Orange County believes is the privilege of being able to sleep inside on a bed to avoid getting COVID, you need to turn in your car keys if you have a car to the provider. You're not allowed to maintain possession of your own car keys. You need to sign an agreement that they can search you and everything you have, your car, your room, at any time, not just when you come in, but anytime they want. You need to agree not to leave the property without permission. In most cases, you don't get a key to your room. So if you decide to go outside for whatever reason on the property, you have to ask a staff person usually to get back into your room. And so there's a long series, and I won't read you the whole form. I'm happy to share it with anyone who wants it. But in the course of that, right, there are certainly some things that particularly for our senior population, the target of this program, are really scary. So for example, most seniors who lost their housing and ended up living in their car, whether or not you agree with it, they are very emotionally tied to the car. It's often a nicer car. It's often from a middle class or upper class life they led before their partner died and they couldn't work anymore after 2008 and they blew through all their savings. And it often is the only thing that they associate with their safety because it's all they've had since they lost their housing. And so for those seniors, when you tell them, hey, there's a room you can sleep in, but you need to give a stranger the keys to your car, that is an insurmountable barrier. It's just not something that they're willing to do. And it's not necessarily because they plan to leave. It's because the trauma-informed approach would be to ask them, hey, what do you need to be able to come in and stay here, and figure out a way to give them what they need. And the approach that we've taken here is, here's the rules we're going to set because our cities don't want to see homeless people. And so we're only going to get them to support this motel program if we promise that they'll never see the homeless people. And so these are the rules we've created to make sure that they cannot come and go from the property. And we'll see, as you know, as we're seeing throughout Orange County lifts of all the rules for shelter in place, what changes. As of today, it hasn't changed. So as of today, people who are in those locations cannot get a ride in and out like regular shelters to just go about their day. If they want to go to a coffee shop, if they want to go shop, you know, many of them have retirement income, just not enough to maintain their housing. If they want to go shopping at senior hour at the grocery store, so far that's not an option. But we certainly will see as the operator, and all of that, about, I think it was 16 million, all of that room key money from Orange County went to one provider, the Illumination Foundation. So they're running all of those sites. So we implemented that. And then Orange County initially said, we're going to put up in each, the county is split into 3 service planning areas, north, central, and south. The county initially said in each service planning area, we're going to put up a sprung structure. We're going to create a new congregate living shelter. It's going to be an emergency plan. But as of today, while the county, as far as I know, has purchased the 3 sprung structures, none of them have been erected, and I have no reason to think that any of them will be, other than maybe the one in Huntington Beach, because there was some evidence on the Huntington Beach agenda when they approved that they were moving forward with the county. But I haven't seen anything to make me think that the county's going to open one in the south service planning area or the north service planning area. In the kind of the rest of the county, in the existing shelters, the county did take steps to decrease numbers, and many of these shelters had average ages of 55. So getting out the seniors was probably going to be enough in many cases to get them down to have a little bit of social distance, at least to the 3-foot rule the county implemented. So the county took those steps in the county shelters, but again, didn't require those steps from the city-run shelters. So while the county was moving these people, one of the questions we kept asking is, well, what's the plan, right? And that's where we are now, is kind of what's the plan? FEMA is potentially going to stop as soon as this month with the subsidies. The state is allowing some extensions, but it's unclear how long those extensions will last and how much of it the state's going to pay. And we now have, I pulled today's numbers because I figured some of you would want to know. So as of today, in Orange County's, if I can read my own handwriting, in the isolation rooms, which are the rooms that are for homeless individuals who either have tested positive for COVID or are presumed positive due to their symptoms, we currently have 59 people in rooms and 78 available rooms for people who could become sick going forward. For those rooms, a person can only stay while they're sick. So if they come from a shelter or from the street as soon as they either are presumed healthy or test negative, they're returned to where they were found, whether that's the shelter or the street. In the vulnerable rooms, so in the rooms that are for people who are over 65 or have a medical condition on the CDC list, we currently have 416 people in rooms and 95 available rooms. And so sometimes the numbers get to a little more than what should be 100%, because if there's a couple, if one person qualifies, both are allowed in. And so the numbers fluctuate a little bit with having kind of an extra person here and there. But they have been in some of the hotels kind of where they've rented the whole hotel, adding another floor to slowly expand the numbers. But that's where they are now. And then what the county did, instead of opening a shelter for the South Service Planning area, is took the old Joplin Juvenile Detention Center. So the place where they used to store about 60 teenage boys, and decided to call that a homeless shelter. And so the county is proud of it, thinks it's a great location. I have much more concern. It's a high fire area, having an evacuation plan. And it's my understanding that they are working on getting an evacuation plan approved by the fire department, which would require having at a minimum enough vehicles on site at all times to transport people. But in light of the COVID pandemic, we shouldn't be packing people into full vehicles. We shouldn't be putting so many people so far out that we're not in a position to move them without forcing them to violate the social distancing goals. It is far enough from hospitals that if someone there does have an emergent need, and many homeless folks do have, especially chronically homeless folks do have health conditions, it would be very difficult for an ambulance to get there and back in a timely manner. And the provider does have some nursing staff, so there's not no medical staff. But the location to me is a pretty big challenge. So the people right now who are in both the Joplin Detention Center, and that is currently 34 people, and who are in Project Roomkey, are from all appearances kind of warehoused. They're getting food, they're getting a bed, but there's no evidence that anyone is working toward getting them housing, employment, increased income. And that is where the conversation kind of ends, is what do we do next? So we are at this really unique moment where we have kind of the perfect storm of things happening. I mean, terrible things, but there is all of a sudden money that we never thought would exist for housing and homelessness. There is CARES money, there's the Project Roomkey money, there is CDBG disaster relief money. So there are a lot of sources of money that are, some of them are one-time sources of money, but there are sources of money that are available to deal with emergency costs, to deal with housing and homelessness in a lasting way. There are also some costs that have gone down, right? So there are going to be hotels and motels that are just not in a position to recover financially from not being able to rent out rooms this season. And some of them are going to be very open to long-term lease or purchase options, to converting into single occupancy rooms. There are going to be office buildings that have a lot of businesses who realized, when you can do all your work on the internet, except for when you can't control your dog, why would you pay rent, right? And so that with these offices, there are going to be spaces that we don't need anymore. There's going to be less need. There are going to be developments, housing developments that lost their funding because of the economic crisis that we're in, and that are going to need someone to step in. So there's going to be kind of this gap in costs that we haven't seen before. And that, while of course buildings are still expensive, is going to be the cheapest they're going to get, right? We're in this moment is as good as it's going to get for the potential to buy solutions. And we know that building the solutions isn't practical. We've seen it for decades now, right? Everyone said years ago, Orange County came up with the plan, everyone was going to build their portion of the permanent supportive housing. It was all going to be done in 3 years, maybe 7 years. And how many of those units have come online? I don't know exactly, but I know it's a very small percent of the commitment. And it's because there's a lot of challenges with new builds, right? That there are between environmental codes and zoning codes and all of the complicated politics of getting things passed and zoning and agreeing on where it should be. And some of those are relaxed right now because of the crisis. But when you're talking about using existing buildings, some of those are irrelevant, right? Using hotels as rooms for people to live in has less challenges in converting those into long-term housing than starting fresh in a space that folks wanted as a park. So there's both kind of increased money, there's decreased barriers, and there's a suddenly an understanding of the shift in balance of costs of shelters versus housing. Shelters have always been a really expensive way to warehouse people. They are traumatic to the people in them. You will find if you go out and talk to folks on the street who are able to, a lot of them will say, no, I'm not in the shelter because there's so many people, there's nowhere to put my stuff. It doesn't feel safe. The staff are not trained properly. And so there's a long list of reasons why shelters are inappropriate for a lot of people, but even for people who stay in them, they are traumatic. Shelters are expensive, right? When we put someone in a shelter, I don't know the exact Orange County cost, but generally they're probably about $50-ish per person per day. And so once you start to add that up, that's not an insignificant amount of money. And if instead of putting that into shelter, we were putting it into buildings, into paying a mortgage, we would be walking away with a tangible asset, right? That if there was no longer a need for it, could be sold instead of kind of down the drain of shelter land. When we have shelters, we pay for service providers to do case management. But what we see in the shelters throughout Orange County is that case management is usually housing navigation. All the case managers have time to do with their massive caseloads and their limited training and qualifications is scramble in a desperate attempt to find people a way to get out of the shelter so they don't have to explain to the city or county funding them why they have the same 200 people in the shelter that they had last month. So they're not helping people with their employment. They're not helping people increase their income. They're not helping people get onto disability or overcome legal challenges. They're desperately scrambling to find housing, and you don't need that if people are in rooms that you can treat as housing. Right? Once you're talking about single occupancy rooms or converted, studios, you don't have to serve people 3 meals a day. They can serve themselves 3 meals a day, just like anyone else in housing. So there's another cost that you don't need to incur in the same way. You can help people build the skills to go to the local food bank. People can kind of gain this stability and independence that comes with having stable housing. And for the small portion of people who are going to need services, who don't just need housing, who actually need higher level care, mental health services, once folks have a few months inside and they get to sleep all night and eat, it becomes much easier to figure out who those people are. Because when people are in shelters and people are outside, it is nearly impossible to guess which of those people actually need the very expensive permanent supportive housing, right? Because we do need permanent supportive housing, but that is the most expensive of the types of housing. And how many of them really just need affordable housing? We need something that they can pay for either with their wages or their disability or their retirement, where they'll be charged 30% of their income and where they will stably be able to take care of themselves, just like all the folks who had more savings or better luck in owning their own home. And so figuring out who those people are and where we're spending money makes a lot more sense once we have the people inside first and we can evaluate that. We can, see, is this person able to take care of themselves? Are they running into challenges? Are they able to pay their portion of the rent on time? Is it something that a little bit of help can get them over the hump of, or do they really need a higher level of care? So when you break down the money and then on top of all of that, right, if people are in the housing and you're charging them instead of just paying for them, you can also help shift the sources of income. So right now, a significant number of our homeless folks either have no income or their only income is general relief, which is kind of the source of last resort. The county under state law for people who are unemployable 12 months a year, and for people who are employable, the minimum is 3 months a year. And Orange County chooses to do the minimum, unlike many other counties, that the county needs to give people a very small amount of money. In Orange County, it's about $350. And that is meant to cover food, housing, utilities, toiletries, all your needs. So it would be a whole nother talk about where they got that number and why it's $350. But the important part is that money, the primary source of income for many of our homeless individuals who are not employed or not on disability, comes directly out of our general fund. So the county is paying that money. The county calls it a loan. They tell people it has to be paid back. And if folks get onto disability, they do withhold from their back pay the amount that they've received. So they do get paid back. And if folks get employed, they probably never actually make enough to pay it back, but it's only 3 months a year. So it's very little that they owe anyway. Well, once people are in housing, it becomes so much easier to help them complete their disability application and get them off of county general fund $300 income and onto disability for those who can't work, which is a federal income of more like $950. So their 30% they're paying in toward their housing is now triple. Their money to spend locally on food and other, hygiene products, everything else is $600 that they never had before. And the county is now, in addition to everything else, saving that general relief money and could even redirect some of that general fund money into, homelessness prevention, into housing. We have a long history of directing it into policing, but maybe we could start to shift that and focus a little more on services. So there's this kind of moment where we have money we haven't had before. We have costs that are high, but as low as they're going to get in the foreseeable future. And we know that because of COVID, we cannot keep warehousing people in congregate living, that it is not safe, that we're seeing more and more reports coming out of all the folks in congregate living who are getting COVID, who are dangerously sick from it, that shelters, in an attempt to try and meet the minimum standards for COVID, are becoming even more expensive than they were before, right? Because they're reducing the number of people they can serve in order to spread people out a little bit. And so the already expensive version of shelter is now more expensive. And so we have kind of all the facts in place to say, well, what the only obvious solution is buy up some of these buildings, right? Get these long-term leases and really get ahead of this at this moment where we have this unique, perfect storm of facts to look at housing solutions in a way we haven't before. So I've done a terrible job reading and talking at the same time. So I'm going to look at the chat and see what questions I've been ignoring real quick. So Project Room Key, when the first question I'm reading is about Project Room Key and the shelters. So when Orange County originally opened Project Room Key, the priority was only people in shelters. I don't know where they got that from because it does not, by my interpretation, match the federal or the state directive, but that's what Orange County did. And I think that probably was to try and reduce the numbers so that they were less over capacity. For example, the courtyard had about 450 people. They have it down to somewhere closer to 250. And so it certainly took some of the pressure off at least the county shelters. It's not clear to me that that happened in the city shelters. It looks like the city shelters, while they did transfer people into Room Key, from what I have been able to gather, the city shelters just refilled all those beds with other people because the county was not creating any rules or accountability to maintain those beds as empty, to be in a position to take people back, to ensure social distancing and compliance with the CDC. It was intended to alleviate some of the crowding in shelters. And that's a big part of the kind of what's next question, right? As the potential funding for Room Key comes to an end, without a plan, we now have 500-ish seniors and medically compromised people in rooms that have to go somewhere. And we certainly do not have the space to get them all back into the shelters, both because of the shelters, the some of the shelters that have filled their beds, and because even in the other shelters, they're attempting to have a little bit of space in between beds to not, there will not be a time in the next 12 to 18 months that it is safe to put 500 people in a room again. So the courtyard being down at 250, that is still well outside any guidelines that we've seen, right? When we're being told gatherings of 10 or 20 or 50 with the right distancing and the right masks, we certainly wouldn't want to see them go back to a number higher than 250. So it's kind of mixed. So yes, it did take some of the pressure off in the shelters that chose to keep those beds empty. And then after they pulled all the people who they thought were qualified and who were willing to go, right? Because some of the folks who qualified were not willing to sign the form with all of the rules about not being allowed to leave and having to turn over their keys and all of the other rules that came with the program. And so there are some people who said, no, I don't want to go, or who went for a day or two and decided that that they really were not okay with being prohibited from going out for a walk, a socially distanced walk like the rest of us for exercise, and decided they'd rather go back to the congregate shelter, even with the higher risk of COVID, because it was necessary for their mental health. But the people who both qualified and wanted to go got in from the shelters first and from the streets next, and they are still kind of actively working on getting people in from the street. So there is a hotline that we give people that the county developed after we pressured them quite a bit. Homeless folks who have a phone or who a volunteer finds can call the hotline and request to get evaluated for Project Room Key. When they call, they're told that they'll get a call back. So if they don't have a phone, that becomes problematic. But usually we can get a volunteer to arrange the call back. And then when they get the call back, they're told that sometime in the next 2 to 3 days, an outreach worker will come and find them. And that outreach worker will decide if they qualify. I have no idea why people who are, I understand for medical conditions, maybe there should be a conversation. I have no idea why people over 65 need an outreach worker to come see them before they can be referred into the program. But that's the system we have. So they wait for the outreach worker to show up in a few days. And then if the outreach worker agrees that they are in fact over 65 or medically compromised, they call Illumination Foundation. So we're now on the third set of entities involved. And Illumination Foundation, as the provider, sends out a vehicle to pick them up and to bring them over to the hotel. If they have a car, they're allowed to drive in as long as they've agreed to turn in the car. So there is kind of a process of getting those folks in, and they get there eventually. So in terms of the next question is about the hotel money and whether there's any left to buy the hotels. There is, there's room for debate every time you hear there's no money, right? Our county has quite a bit of money, but we make choices, make priority choices about how to spend it. So we have CalOptima has, many millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in reserves. Our county has general fund money, and we certainly, like all other governments, are going to have a budget crisis coming out of COVID, but we are also going to spend money, right? And so we're going to be making choices. Are we going to spend that money on turning the Music jail facility into a mental health jail to ensure that the 50% of inmates who have mental health problems can be kept in jail? Or are we going to spend that money on building housing, buying hotels, and getting those folks with mental health needs into housing where we can provide them with adequate medical care, where they can recover and succeed? And these are value choices that our county is going to have to make. And historically, we have chosen the path of enforcement of jails and law enforcement. But the state is not going to probably cover every dollar. The state has committed to doing some funding for buying these locations. The state has negotiated some deals. I understand a lot of local governments are finding working with the state on it to be more challenging than they hoped. But the state will pay for some of it. The state will not indefinitely pay for room key for the rentals. At some point, they would need to be working on purchases of buildings and working with the state on what and how they would pay. But also, there is, like, the county does have money, and we made choices, right? So with the CARES money, I don't know if folks watched the supervisors meeting about the CARES money. The supervisors could have said, hey, we just got hundreds of millions of dollars. We should probably buy up some of these motels. I understand that businesses are hurting, and that, I run a small business. I understand the struggle that is trying to keep your doors open and trying to pay your staff. But at some point, we need to make these value decisions. And if we are going to choose preserving businesses and providing more support to businesses, in addition to what's federally available, because many of us we got the PPP loans and other loans to help us through this time. And we're going to choose to prioritize that in how we spend the CARES money instead of prioritizing buying buildings. It certainly will be harder. But I think I'll just end with what I started on that question, which is anytime there's a claim by the county that we're out of money, there's a value choice and a lack of creative thinking. I haven't heard any talk about the CalOptima money, and it is a moment where more than ever, there's no denying that housing is a healthcare need. And so when we have a county healthcare agency and we have a county health insurance provider and we have a health crisis, starting to talk about why we're not using some of that health money to prevent the health crisis with housing should be on the table. And while we're talking about, while we're seeing a national movement to divest investments in policing and military policing and to invest in education and housing, those are things that should be on the table. We're currently in the budget cycle, which I suspect that many of you are familiar with or will be. And so this is the time to look at what your supervisor is choosing to do with the money and whether that reflects your priorities. And if not, make phone calls. So let's see. What percentage of the unhoused people do I think? So there have been put in rooms. I think there's probably, it's hard to guess how many of the people in rooms came from shelters versus came directly from being unsheltered. At the last homeless count, Orange County had in the point in time count where you walk out and count people physically, it was just under 7,000. A few days later, our CalOptima, our Medi-Cal provider, came out and said, oh, you never asked us before to check how many of the people we serve don't have home addresses, but we had about 10,000 this year. And we've always known that the point in time count was an undercount, but that was a clear indication. So it seems likely that it's closer to 10,000 than 7,000. Between all the shelters and room key, we probably have somewhere in the range of 2,000 to 2,500 people who are in some form of shelter or room. And the rest, and of the other portion, you know, the other 7,000-ish, or even if you want to go on the low estimate, 5,000-ish. Some of them are living in cars. Many are well hidden, right? We see with people like Disney employees that they are usually pretty well hidden and living in cars. We see with seniors that they park the car in the neighborhood. Like when I have senior homeless clients in Irvine, they park their car in the neighborhood where their home was because their car does not look out of place. And so the neighbors are used to seeing it there, and the neighbors don't know they lost their home if they see them walking around. And so it becomes easy to blend in when you're talking about senior communities like Laguna Hills, Laguna Woods. Right? It is embarrassing to lose your housing, and people do their best to stay hidden. The folks you see are the people who are more visible because they are either, you know, having more mental health issues or other challenges, or just don't have a good place to hide. So kind of percent wise, somewhere, depending on what number you want to take, there's probably somewhere between 25 and 50% in some form of shelter or housing. Congregate living, the next question I'm reading is congregate living being staffed like acute care hospitals during a pandemic to avoid incurring more infections and death. That sounds amazing, but that is not related to what's happening. So the county has been pretty clear with me that there are no standards being implemented at the congregate living shelters at all if the county doesn't personally operate them. That for all of the city ones, that they can do whatever they want because the county is not in the enforcement business. And again, that's a right. We could direct them as the voters that is unacceptable. For the county shelters, they are taking some steps like the distancing, but they are certainly not doing anything even remotely close to the types of steps that are being taken at the jail of intense cleaning. Nothing close to what's being taken in skilled nursing facilities, and certainly nothing close to what's being taken in care hospitals. Why am I serving the homeless community? It was phrased a lot nicer. You guys can read it. So I don't have a good answer for that. People ask me a lot. So I have always lived a relatively comfortable life, and I've never had to worry about where I was going to sleep. And even when I had this crazy idea to start a nonprofit and risk not being able to come up with enough money to run it properly, I was in a position of privilege where I knew that if everything went terribly and the business fell apart and I couldn't pay my rent, I could move back to the East Coast and I wouldn't be homeless because I had parents that would take me in. And so I always kind of throughout my life have worked with people experiencing homelessness. I have always struggled with the idea that we live in a country where housing is not a right. It never made sense to me, even as a kid, how a person who didn't know where they were going to sleep and what they were going to eat could possibly go about the day successfully. So even when I was in high school, we used to, for the traveling homeless shelter that would come to my temple, they would come to us on Christmas and Easter because those were the times the churches weren't available. And we would always run a babysitting ring because when we were kids, we kind of looked around and said, wait a second, this is the service we offer as teenagers is babysitting. That's what we do for the rich parents. We just charge lots of money. These homeless families never get a night off because you can't go hire a babysitter. And so the thing that we were able to do as kids was get donated movie tickets and watch all the children. So when the families came to the temple, that the parents could have a night out, like people who weren't struggling to survive. And so so it's not necessarily a thing or an experience or a religious motive in the way that I think people are often expecting the answer to be, but just kind of it seems to me that should be the minimum standard, and that in order to have people be happy and healthy and successful, we should all be working toward a place where people always have a safe room with a door that locks. Can I share the project room key number? I can, and I will at the end of answering questions when I can flip to my email and post it in without making.
I had a few people jump in just after you and provide the number. So if you have time, then that's fine. But otherwise, it seems like it's being handled by the rest of the chat.
Medicare for all, make resources available for social services. In addition to providing medical care, all agencies would save somewhere from 10 to 50% of their annual budget. No argument with that. I've never done the Medicare for all numbers, but I agree that clearly that providing everyone with baseline health insurance and having that health insurance cover people's needs would be better for community health, right? in light of the COVID pandemic, we see more than ever, and we've highlighted the places in which our failures to serve the most vulnerable in our community are harming our community health. And by our community health, I mean the health of every single one of us. And so until we decide to make societal choices that are going to provide minimum levels of care to every single one of us, we are going to continue to struggle with our community's health as a whole. And that is everything from healthcare to housing. The idea of housing as part of healthcare isn't novel. It's something that's already built into our insurance. So for example, we can, in our current structure with our current provider, if a homeless individual is in the hospital and they have a condition and it's acute and the hospital determines that putting them back outside would interfere with their recovery, the hospital can prescribe something called recuperative care. Hospital fills out a form that says this person needs to be in recuperative care. They do it because it will be much more expensive for the hospital if that person goes outside and the infection gets worse than if they go pay $80 or $100 a day, which is a lot less than staying in a hospital, to stay in a recuperative care housing facility where a nurse checks on them. And so the current system allows hospitals to prescribe usually up to 90 days of recuperative care. So the idea of prescribing some form of housing isn't novel. We just have not yet made it a kind of a standard where if a person comes in with diabetes, the doctor can say, oh, you're not managing your diabetes because you don't have a refrigerator. Let me prescribe you housing where you could take care of yourself and your food. Well, we, in the kind of the grand scheme of subsidies, right, we've made choices. So food stamps, anyone who financially qualifies for food stamps gets to have food stamps. Family, CalWorks is what we call in California, our family subsidy. GRs, what we call our emergency cash aid. Those are all types of subsidies that we have generally are federally funded, that we say, if you financially qualify and sometimes follow a few other rules and have a social security number, then you get this until you no longer qualify. With our housing subsidy program, we made a different value judgment. We decided we would put an arbitrary cap on the number of subsidies. So people who financially qualify and apply for our housing subsidy program, if they're lucky enough to even get on a wait list, are going to wait 7 to 10 years in most cases in hopes of maybe someday getting the subsidy. And it's not because it's a different type of program than all other federal programs. It's because we seem to have arbitrarily decided that housing subsidies should have a limit to how many people deserve them and other subsidies should not. And I've never seen a good reason for that, other than that our society has not put housing at the same value as these other things. But again, that within the light of the COVID crisis, we're in a moment where we can really have those honest conversations about public health and about healthcare and about the role that housing and safe space plays in your ability to wash your hands, to take a shower, and how that impacts public health and individual health and the cost of healthcare.
I think that's all the questions that we have, but maybe the final question that we could ask is something that almost always gets asked, which is, what would be the number one thing leaving this conversation tonight that you think everybody watching should go and do? Should we call our supervisor? Should we go visit your website? Should we donate? What should we be doing?
Well, I can't argue with donating. We always appreciate that. We're in the middle of trying to hire a lawyer. But in terms of kind of really, I think the two biggest things are really what you're doing right now, which is educating yourselves, and then taking the next step, which is educating everyone you know, which can be exhausting, right? That when you are in your Nextdoor app, when you're sitting in meetings and you're attending your city council meeting and your county board of supervisor meeting, and you hear someone say something that is disconnected from reality, taking the time to engage them in the exhausting conversation about why the thing they're saying isn't true. I can't count the number of times that my Nextdoor app response has been, it's unfortunate you're spreading that propaganda. Here's a link to a website with facts. And just taking the time to link them to the United Way report, link them to the website, the county website that has facts on it, but trying to get people past kind of those, all the homeless people don't want help. All the shelters are empty. There's plenty of space. Nobody wants anything. Well, is it true that sometimes when a sheriff says, can I offer you services? Someone says no? Yes, especially when it's the same sheriff that arrested them yesterday. But it is also true that all evidence shows that when we go through the trauma-informed steps, when we have a healthcare first approach, when we hire social workers instead of police officers to be the ones doing the outreach, and when we ask people, instead of saying, hey, the thing we can offer you is a bed next to some strangers in a bus terminal, if instead we say, what do you need to be successful? And if they say socks, we start off with giving them socks. And then we come back the next day and say, today, what do you need to be successful? And if they say food, we start with food. And we work with people from where they are to where they need to be. People who have been let down by the system over and over, often former foster youth, have been left down for their entire lives, that we see that those methods are successful. And so really investing the time in encouraging people to follow evidence. But specifically and locally, I would say, get involved with this budget that's happening right now. Take a look at it. And if you think that community policing or community safety or public safety, whatever we're calling it right now, is being over budgeted, and you think that housing and healthcare are being under budgeted, speak up, call your city, call your county, call the sheriff's office, call all of those people and send emails and make sure that they know that you and everyone you know that you can talk into calling with you, right? Because everyone's kind of stuck home right now. So for the people who are home, you have time to call in the morning and the evening, right? You could call your supervisor in the morning every day and say, hey, I'm just wondering if you have a plan for the 500 people in Project Room Key. Are you buying the buildings? No? Well, okay, I'll be calling back this afternoon to see if you've discussed it. I can call back in the afternoon and see whether or not they've discussed it. And you can keep doing that every day until you start to hear answers about what the long-term plan is going to be.
Brooke,
Yes.
the members of Canyon Dams often ask us, who are on the board, executive board, and the volunteers, what they can do to help some of these problems. So if there are particular times that are most useful for us to make calls or send emails, if you can give us or have somebody give us who they call and what the message should be, we are happy to pass that along.
That sounds great. I will pull some stuff together before the next meeting, because we are, in terms of specifically the county budget and the room key operations, we are right now in the period where over the next week or so, those decisions are going to have to be getting made. And there is the mix of the COVID money, the budget cycle, and also the public pressure to start divesting a little in policing, right? To start thinking about, should our cities be hiring police departments for our schools? Or should we maybe redirect that money into making sure every child in that school has a safe place to sleep? If it was me, I would choose safe place to sleep. And so there's lots of evidence, right? Like pre-Columbine, school violence could progressively going down. Columbine happened. Schools and Republicans panicked. We put police in every school. And because of the long history of police violence has escalated since then in our schools. And there is no evidence to back up that having police in schools will do anything other than escalate violence. But there's lots of evidence to support that children with safe places to sleep have less trauma and do better in school. And so really kind of looking at where is that money going and how can we be vocal about telling the county where we think it should go. So I will definitely check in with you about that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your spending your time with us. We can tell how busy you are. Thank you so much for spending time with us tonight, and it was very informative.
Thanks for having me. And I'm definitely, if anybody has other questions, I'm happy to just send me emails. It may take me a day or two if it doesn't look urgent, but I will always answer them eventually.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to everybody for coming.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe if we all start pulling on